Okay, so Diogenes the Cynic is quite a famous figure. Even if you barely know anything about philosophy, you probably heard about this guy because he lived in a big jar, so to speak, in a big vat. But this is just like the most famous fact from his life, and I would like to tell you a bit more about him. So, as you can see, he lived in more or less in the third century, in the fourth century BC, and he was quite a he had quite a personality. Another Diogenes from Laertia, is famous for writing different biographies and stories about the philosophers from the past, and he wrote quite extensively about Diogenes. And most of the stuff we know about this guy is from another Diogenes. But anyway, let's move straight to the topic. So he was a guy from Sinope, and he was famous. Like, he came from a very difficult kind of family. So his father worked in the financial area, but he was actually making his main profit by making fake coins. And there is a possibility that Diogenes was making fake coins with his father as well. And this is largely considered to be the main reason behind his troubles, behind his exile. So he was from Sinope, just a moment. So he was from Sinope, but he didn't really live there much, and he moved to Athens, and there he was basically living like a homeless person, but a homeless person who's proud of being homeless. So he despised people. He thought that he lived the right life, how it's supposed to be lived, and other people are wrong. They are too dependent on their slaves, they're too dependent on their hobbies and on the rich way of life they're living. And this is all making life harder, making it complicated, and not really a free kind of life, not a free person. So he thought that instead of all that, a person should live with a minimum, an absolute minimum of what this person can live with. And he decided to live in this huge vat because he thought that this is enough of a home. Nobody needs a bigger home, a fancier home. And there is this one story that is told about him, is that he had quite a good bowl for drinking, like a cup, you might say. And once he saw a poor boy drinking water from his hands, like that, just drinking water, and Diogenes broke his own cup and never had one since then, because he felt like this boy was living an even simpler life than Diogenes. So this cup is not necessary for life, thus I have to live without it. Now, it's worth noticing, it's worth saying what makes him different from any typical homeless person is actually that he had a very good education. He was a philosopher with good ancient Greek background. He was a pupil of Antisthenes, who was a pupil of Socrates. And Diogenes also knew Plato, although he didn't respect him. Plato lived at the same time as Diogenes the Cynic, and there are famous stories of Diogenes basically breaking into Plato's classes and disrupting them, mocking them. Like once, when Plato was trying to define a human being in the simplest, from logical point of view, kind of way, that Plato defined a human being as a featherless, two-legged creature, as a featherless biped. And this guy, Diogenes the Cynic, took a bird, took a chicken, and stripped it out of its feathers and brought it to the class Plato was teaching and said, "Look, this is Plato's man." And he liked doing stuff like that. So if you remember last time, we were talking about Plato's ideas, which are more like ideals with L. And Diogenes said, like, he also came to Plato's class and said, well, I can see a table and I can see a chair, but I don't see the idea of table or idea of chair. So why would we care thinking about it? So he didn't like Plato, but people from Athens kind of liked Diogenes, even as you can see on this famous picture, people didn't think that he was like a problem for Athens, because if they did, they could just banish him, like he was banished from Sinope. It wouldn't be a problem. So in Athens, they had this rich cultural backgrounds back then, and they liked different kind of philosophers to be around, so to speak. So they could see very serious intellectuals like Plato and Diogenes, who was kind of mocking them, but also was smart in his own way. So Diogenes didn't actually mock philosophy, even though you might think he would do that. He believed that the philosophy of Plato and those kind of guys is just not the right one. He believed that he is a philosopher, but he's showing what philosophy means by an example. So he believed that his life was full of philosophy. And this was, well, in a sense, this was his own philosophical approach to live the simplest life, not to depend on anyone or anything, not to have any like deep feelings to anyone, for anyone, and stuff like that. So some other of his stories, like, yeah, so living in a jar was mainly associated with the period of his life when he lived in Athens. But then, yes, but let's just stop for a moment at Athens. So when he was living there, Plato quite often, it seems, called him a dog. And this is actually how he got this name. This is what cynicism means. This comes from the word kynikos, as you can see here in ancient Greek, which means dog-like, because Diogenes believed that this is the kind of life one should be kind of living, a life of a dog, of a stray dog that finds some food and eats it, that might find a small shelter to sleep in, that likes people, that tries to be pleasant with people who help it, and bites people who aren't helping this dog. So basically, he just owned it. And people were making fun of him, but he was just kind of appropriating those names and stuff they were saying about him, and saying like, yes, that's true, that's who I am, but like, I'm still the best among you. It's quite famous. There are various occasions explained when he was saying that there aren't many people around, like true human beings. Like when he was on this huge gathering of people, and somebody then asked him, well, were there many people there? And he said, well, there was a lot of demos, you might say, because people in, like, it's tricky in English because people means both like a nation, so to speak, and people as plural from human beings. So he said that there weren't many true humans, but there was this mass of somebody human like, let's put it this way. Yeah, and so he did think of himself as a better being, as a higher being. So, and one of these bright examples of the lifestyle he held was when he decided to move from Athens. He was traveling to another town by sea, and he was captured by pirates, and he was actually enslaved. And as a slave, he was sold to another guy. And when the guy who bought him was thinking, like, he was asking, well, what can you do, which are your skills useful as a slave, he said, well, I can govern people. I'm very good at this. And when that guy bought Diogenes, Diogenes said, now you do what I tell you to do. And obviously, the owner of Diogenes as a slave didn't quite like this attitude and said, like, what do you mean? It's the other way around. But Diogenes said, well, if you bought a slave who was a good doctor, would you listen to him as a doctor when he tells you about diseases and how to cure some stuff? And he said that, well, I am like that in life. I'm a professional of how it's supposed to be. And actually, since Diogenes had this good background as a pupil of Socrates, the guy who bought him decided that Diogenes should be the teacher to his children. And Diogenes was indeed trying to teach them some basics about life, about thinking, and obviously like some basics like how to write, how to read, because Diogenes knew all that stuff very, very well. He just kind of despised it. There are some people saying that Diogenes wrote some stories, wrote some texts, but others say that those texts weren't really written by Diogenes because he thought that philosophy should be lived, not written and then studied as a text. And when somebody, there is another story that when somebody asked him, well, why won't you write your text so that we can read it? He said, you fools, you want an, I don't know, an adapted version of a lesson while you're getting a real one right now. Like the way I behave, this is my philosophy, this is my lesson. And yeah, so another thing Plato called him is crazy version of Socrates, because Socrates was also kind of famous for annoying people, for asking them various questions, and for being more like for believing that philosophy is more of a lifestyle than some abstract teaching. But this this way of describing Diogenes as a crazy Socrates actually makes a lot of sense, because living in a jar and eating only if somebody gives you something to eat, if somebody helps you, and not caring and even despising anyone who tries to give you a gift, this is in a sense it might be called crazy. But then again, he was very respected, and there are some stories about Diogenes meeting Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedonia, who also lived at that time. And that Alexander, after meeting Diogenes, he said, well, if I couldn't be Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes the Cynic. And then the Diogenes replied, well, if I couldn't be Diogenes, I would still like to be Diogenes. So he didn't want to be anyone but himself. But Diogenes, it's unclear how much of his lifetime he actually spent living in a huge vat like that, like you can see in the picture, because most accounts describing him as living in this kind of way are related to Athens, but when he was sold as a slave and then became a teacher to the owner's children, he actually, like, people say that he was living in the home of his owner, and this lasted till the rest of his life, more or less, even though some people say that he occasionally went to live in a vat even back then. Accounts of his death are also very weird. One version is that he ate a raw octopus and got sick from cholera and died. And another version is that he stopped breathing intentionally. He just decided to stop breathing, and he was doing it really hard, and eventually he choked on himself and died. So cynicism, in the way you might know this word nowadays, is used in a slightly different way from what Diogenes meant, I think, because I'm pretty sure that a common sense view of a cynic wouldn't be basically a homeless person living on the street and not having any possession. I think when you think of somebody who's a cynic, you rather imagine somebody who is in good clothes and, I don't know, maybe smoking and despising everyone around him. But in a way, Diogenes was cooler than that because he was objectively a poor, exiled person and even a slave for a long time in his life. But he always still kept despising people and thinking that he is the coolest guy out there, or maybe not thinking, but at least making others think that he thought so, because we can't know what his inner feelings were. So he kept this kind of lifestyle throughout his life. And yeah, in short, cynicism is not only about despising other people and about focusing on self interest, but also about asceticism. And this is something he got from his philosophy background, because this way of life, when you try not to live like the rich people do, when you try to do with the minimum, is actually quite famous in various branches of philosophy. So it's not only cynicism, it's also stoicism, it's also all sorts of religious philosophy, right? Like we have monasteries, we have monks and nuns, but they don't despise people, and Diogenes did. So here is the difference.